The stories and poems and essay that I've selected for you to read for this week are things that are related to the first theme that we're going to approach, which is the theme of innocence and experience. It's a pretty common theme across literary texts. In a lot of cases, as is the case with some of these pieces, Half a Day in Araby in particular, but Salvation as well, these are really texts that deal with the idea of losing some sort of childhood innocence or having a realization about a moment of what the world is like as a grown-up. With both Half a Day and Araby, which I thought were a nice pairing because one is an early 20th century Irish piece, the other is a later 20th century piece from Egypt. You've got these very different authors, very different narrators, but they're really ultimately talking about the same sort of thing. Schoolboys sort of learning something about the world, and that moment of change for them then renders the world completely different, completely alien to what they are used to, and particularly alien to the innocence of childhood that they were accustomed to prior to the story. And so what I want you to think about as you are doing this, what I want you to consider in doing this is certainly consider the theme, right? Consider how the theme is developed in the story. To do that, I would start with watch the video that I created for you talking about developing a theme or discovering the theme. But also keep considering it, keep looking for pieces that help magnify that idea or illuminate the idea for you. It's very important as you do that to not only think very generally, very broadly, but look for specific quotations, look for specific pieces of the text that show you the innocence and the experience. Now, I do want to acknowledge in this, of course, literature, every piece of literature can have more than one theme, just as it will have more than one topic. We do want to differentiate topic from theme, of course. Topic is what it's about. Theme is what the piece says about that topic, and not necessarily a moral. Anyway, so for example, in terms of looking for specific text, we can think about the beginning. I'm looking at Half a Day by Mahfouz, starting on page 88. In this, he talks about sort of his fear of going to school, right, as a child, that he doesn't want to go, that home is such this wonderful place, and that the place itself is frightening, that where he's coming from is a paradise of sorts. The second paragraph on page 88, he says, "My mother stood at the window watching our progress, and I would turn toward her from time to time as though appealing for help. We walked along a street lined with gardens. On both sides were extensive fields planted with crops, prickly pears, henna trees, and a few date palms." So we have this image of this really beautiful Edenic place, right? It's this paradise that he is going towards as he fears going to school, right? That he talks about school being punishment. And later, further down the page, he talks as the school gate closes in on him. He says, "I did not know what to say. The gate was closed, letting out a pitiable screech. Some of the children burst into tears. The bell rang. The lady came, followed by a group of men." Right? And so it's this almost incarceration for the children. But as he goes through the day, just half a day, he has this sort of experience of wonder and realizing these new people, this new family in this educational setting. And by the time he ends, right, by the time he's at the end of the story, he realizes that things have changed profoundly. And of course, quite literally, as a child, he's not realizing, I thought it was paradise, then I wasn't. He's not quite literally having these experiences, but he is having, as an author or as a narrator, recognizing and personifying or explaining what it is that happens as we go from childhood to adulthood. Remember, going into school, everything outside of school seemed like Eden, seemed perfect. By the time he's at the end, at the bottom of page 89, he says, "And again, he shook me by the hand and went off. I proceeded a few steps, then came to a startled halt. Good Lord! Where was the street lined with gardens? Where did it disappear to? When did all these vehicles invade it? And when did all these hordes of humanity come to rest upon its surface? How did these hills of refuse come to cover its side? And where were the fields that bordered it?" Right? So in half a day, none of this stuff has happened. It's just that he has noticed the adult world for the first time, that he has noticed that the world outside of the school gates is not perfect. It is not the paradise that he had hoped for. Rather, the school becomes the paradise instead. Rather, he becomes a member of the world. In much the same way, things like this happen in Araby. In Araby, you have a young boy who has a crush, right? And we all recall those childhood crushes that we had that seemed, a little embarrassing, right, in retrospect. But certainly as a child, right, we have the narrator of Araby going about expecting that the world is this wonderful place, seeing all these amazing, wonderful things, and going on, in the case of the narrator of Araby, going on a quest. He quite literally carries a grail through throngs of foes, just like a medieval knight on a grail quest. And so he's doing all of these things in hopes to make happy this girl he barely knows. And he goes off to the bazaar, not realizing what it actually is, which is simply a marketplace with a fancy exotic name, peopled by English teenagers who are working the stalls, who are not interested in him, that his belief is shattered. And he has at the end of it what's called an epiphany, which is a particularly important term in Joyce's work, and you can certainly look up epiphany in the glossary of our textbook. So I want to just draw your attention to these are a couple of ways we can think about themes, and we can think about comparing texts, which you're certainly welcome to do in your community posts. But I also want to draw your attention to these things because we don't want to just pay attention to character. Obviously, when we're talking about innocence and experience, we're talking very deeply about character, but we're also talking about all of the other things that make a text literary. These are things like setting. Certainly that's important. It's deeply important in James Joyce's Araby. To symbolize the innocence, the narrator talks about his backyard, including a fruit tree in the middle of an overwild garden, right, which of course symbolizes the Garden of Eden. In both of these stories, really, we have this Edenic possibility linked to childhood, linked to that innocence. So we can think about setting. We also want to think about imagery, right? Anytime anything is described that appeals to one of the five senses, most often it will be to sight, right? That's a pretty clear, right? Images, quite clearly, but even to sound. Joyce makes a great deal of use of imagery of sound. We hear sort of what the throng in the marketplace is like. Mafuz's piece also does a little bit of that. And finally, we want to think about figurative language, right? Anytime you have a metaphor or a simile, that's a good place to start. We talk about that in poetry, and I've included it some in the poetry discussion, but it's important in prose as well, whether that prose is short stories or whether that prose is nonfiction, like Langston Hughes's piece, Salvation. The point is that there is literary language, that it's not just telling a story the way you tell a story to your friends. That's what makes it literature rather than just an anecdote or rather than just a piece of informational text like you would find in a textbook about, say, astronomy, or a piece of information about the food that you're preparing, right? Directions in a cookbook. That's informational text as opposed to literature. So we want to look for all of those things as we do this. I'm also going to post some videos that attend to some of the other things you're reading in this section of the book that will talk a little more specifically about things, more specifically about exact texts, but we'll also give you some other ideas of the types of things you're doing. As I said, you want to look for these things, right? Setting and imagery and figurative language is helpful to look at. You always want to quote directly when you're writing about literature. Even in your journals, it's very helpful to actually quote something and talk about what does it mean, how does it help you understand the text, how is it showing you something about the text itself. So character and plot, very important, but so are all of these other things. And this is just sort of how we're opening, how we are breaking these pieces open, and we begin to think about this idea, in these cases, about innocence and experience.